Hi, my name is John O'Brien. I'm the Regional Vice President for OPSU in Region 7. From 1911 to the end of the 60s, the CSAO represented Ontario Public Service members only. So Vic, how did that begin to change?
Well, John, the 1970s were probably the most dramatic years in the history of our union. We had some of the most colorful characters in CSO OPSU at that time, and I can talk about them a little later as we go on. But in 1971, we forayed into the semi-private, semi-public sector by starting to organize hospitals and children's aid societies, and we did certify the CAD academic in the colleges of teachers, which was a difficult task because all this organizing was challenged by the government because of our 1927 CSAO Incorporated in our letters patent causes all kinds of problems. In this instance, the problem was our letters patent did not allow us to organize anybody other than public servants, and there was a challenge by the government to that. And we had an interesting way of getting around that. We applied for a federal charter um, under the name CSAO National, other than CSAO Incorporated Ontario, and we set up a separate board of directors as required by a federal charter, and we brought the CAD academic and the beginning of the hospitals and children's aid societies into CSAO through the back door, so to speak. So it was a very innovative way of getting into organizing and representing people other than the Ontario Public Service. And it wasn't until 1972 that we got the charter, but we did have them certified, the CAD academic, in 1971. Another interesting scenario, if I may, was when we started to get into a national union setting with the rest of the provinces trying to get civil servants from across this country into an umbrella organization. There have been several other attempts to do this earlier, but none was so formalized as this one. And the name of the organization was the Canadian organization, CF George, the Canadian Federation of Government Employees Organization, which was the predecessor, in a way, of NUPSI, the National Union of Provincial Government Employees, which came somewhat later years. And the president of this organization was the first vice president of OPSU, or CSAO at the time, a guy by the name of Sid Oxenham, who was from the fire marshal's ministry or department at that time, out of Toronto. And the interesting situation there was Harold Bowen, who was the general manager of CSAO at the time. He'd been around for quite some time. He'd been a former president of CSAO, created a position of general manager, and then filled it himself, and became known as Mr. CSAO, and was quite a dictator. And he did not have any like for Sid Oxenham any more than Sid Oxenham liked him. So there was a very small spark there that eventually grew into a large fire, and CSAO had some rough times during the early 70s trying to fight its battles eternally and fighting it with the government. So this was the beginning of a series of fights with general managers that we'll get into later. Another big development in 1970 was the Darcy McHugh, who was the Treasurer of Ontario, introduced 5% wage controls, and it was only for Ontario public servants. It did not affect the private sector or quasi-public sector, which finally woke up a sleeping giant to some extent, because the 5% was part of the prelude to the Crown Employees Collective Bargaining Act, SEPA, which we lived under for a long time under a lot of pressure and a lot of injustice, and we'll go into that as we discuss the 70s further on. But basically in 1971, those were the big events. In 1972, well, I should say in 1971, when they did put those 5% wage controls in, the board of directors of CSAO notified the government they're going on a 1-week strike, and we fanned out across the province trying to spread the word about to fight this 5% wage control, which was only imposed upon us and not upon the rest of the workers in the province. And I can recall doing Region 7, I was Vice President at the time, doing Region 7, and I'm telling you, I was in Kenora one night, Geraldton the one night, back in Thunder Bay, and Nipigon, and it was a hectic week. But we did get the message through, and the government did back off on the 5%. So it was really a new type of development for CSAO. We never did seem to fight anything. We always went cap in hand, so the government was surprised that we stood up this time.
So Vic, it appears like there was a lot of upheaval going on around that time. So what kind of internal changes happened in the CSAO between about 1969 and 72?
Well, John, in 1972 there was some major restructuring of CSAO. We previously had operated under districts with geographic representation, but that all changed when the hospitals and CAT Academic CAT Support came in. Not necessarily to accommodate that, but the change came anyways to representation by division. And by representation by division boiled down to each ministry had a representative on the board. CAT Academic had one representative, CAT Support had one, and the Niagara Parks Commission had one. Larger ministries, there was a formula. My recollection that the Ministry of Health had 3 people. Department of Highways or Ministry of Transport and Communications had 3. I think ComSec had 2. Natural Resources had 1. I was elected province-wide for Natural Resources, and I had about 1,800 members. It was not a fair system of representation. First of all, I was the only person elected to that board. I think the next one was North Bay. So there was no one in this whole entire Region 7 for representation other than myself. And the sizes of the ministries varied so much that one-on-one representation was really unfair. I can recall, for instance, the Ministry of Tourism. I had one representative on that board, and that person had probably around 240 members to represent province-wide, as opposed to the 1,800 I had to have. And just thinking back on that, I can recall at one convention when this person became re-elected, we used to have suites, and the smaller ministries held their division meetings in their suites because they never had that many delegates. The other ones, such as myself in health, had rooms, meeting rooms in a hotel to do our elections. And for some reason or other, my elections were finished earlier. I was re-elected. I went knocking on the suite, his door suite, thinking he'd be finished. He's sitting there at this little table having a drink with this one guy. And he said, "Oh, Vic, we're not quite finished our meeting yet. If you want to go in the other room, watch TV." And I'm sort of looking, saying to myself, what meeting? There's only one other guy in here. So I watched TV for a while, and he come and got me after, and he said, "Yeah, I've just been elected for another term here. Elvin here, he doesn't want it. The other guy didn't show up, so I'm the elected representative for another 2 years." And I thought, this is really unfair. How can this guy have equal power in terms of representation on a province-wide board, being elected by one person that didn't really want to run? So, and other people across the province, for instance, health with 5,000 members, fighting for representation. So the people that were in the larger ministries could see that this was a very unfair form of representation, and this restructuring was not what was cooked up to be. And of course the smaller ministries just loved it. After all, having all that power representing 244 people. And some of these people were not very bright. The guy in question, I can recall, when we had a board meeting one time, we used to have these things called lepagisms, because his name was Joe Lepage, and he came up with these silly questions. I can recall one was that Jake Norman, at the time, was general manager, saying that he was going to introduce a clipping service because it was easier to hire someone to do that than have the staff do it. And the boss jumps up and says, "You don't really mean to say we're going to be paying for the staff's haircuts now, do you?" And Norman went right along with him, said, "Well, Joe, you know, our staff have to meet with the government across the table, other employees. We want them to look nice." And Joe said, "Well, now that you put it that way, I guess you're right." And then when the staff had cars, Jake Norman said something about credit cards. And he said, "You don't really mean they're going to buy gas with these credit cards, do you?" So those were the lepagisms, and this was the kind of representation that some people got because of the system.
So Vic, as a result of a report that Judge Little was commissioned to do in 1969, the government of the day, as you know, hired Judge Little to do a report. It came out around 1971, and as a result of that, the government introduced legislation, and they called it the Crown Employees Collective Bargaining Act. As a result of that legislation, what happened within the CSAO?
Well, John, SECPA, the Crown Employees Collective Bargaining Act, was supposed to be a legislation to be all to end all to make bargaining possible in the public service, but it really contained more management rights than union rights. In fact, one newspaper said in an editorial, one wonders what's left to negotiate, because there were 21 items that were non-negotiable, and there was very little to negotiate. The bargaining unit, that was one good thing that came out of this report. The bargaining unit was reduced by 23%. In other words, 23% of the current bargaining unit was deemed to be management. So that made some strange changes in the internal structure too, because many of the presidents and executive board were managers and were excluded and no longer held their positions. So we started at least to get into some semblance of being a bargaining unit without being filtered with management all the way through it. And there was the right to strike was silent. It wasn't one of his Judge Little's mandates, but he commented on it anyway, saying that civil servants should not have the right to strike, and arbitrators should be fair, and all that type of BS. But we were very unhappy, at least as a board we were very unhappy about that legislation. Unfortunately, when we tried to fight it before it was passed, before the third reading, we did everything we could to get people out to fight it, and people just sat there, couldn't care less. We went up to Queen's Park expecting a bunch of people to join us. Well, the executive board was standing outside Queen's Park, and finally someone phoned the staff at our head office in Toronto at that time, the CSAO's head office, and pulled everyone out except the switchboard operator to get up there and form a line. We had two stray dogs before we had two members come out. And ironically, at lunchtime, out of that complex of Queen's Park that had 10,000 civil servants in it, two young women, came out at lunchtime and ate their lunch with us. So that was the extent of the opposition, the manned opposition to SECPA. And the NDP, the New Democratic Party, had stalled it in the House and criticized it and talked about the way civil servants were treated like second-class citizens. And when the bill passed, the third reading, there was no one from CSAO in the House. And the NDP were not happy campers after the fight they put up for civil servants who would not fight for themselves. So it was very discouraging for us as a board of directors at that time to watch this terrible piece of legislation go through, labor legislation that shackled civil servants. There was no right to involve themselves in politics, no right to strike. These 21 exemptions were just absolutely unnecessary for bargaining. So we were pretty dejected when we left Queen's Park that day. The interesting thing is that the Management Board of Cabinet met with us to discuss the situation without their chief negotiator fellow by the name of Rolly Scott, who had negotiated the whole SECPA thing with us, if you could call it negotiations. And the one change that he made, that the management board made, was that public servants could read their classification, which was excluded. That was the one change. And when Rolly Scott found out about that, changing that without his knowledge, he almost had a shit hemorrhage, because he said, "You'll rue the day that you allowed them to do that, because you should have given them the right to strike if you want to do something like that, because this is going to cost you a fortune. Every civil servant in the province will think he's underclassified, and they'll be putting the classification grievance in." And how true that rung. And it wasn't good for the union either, in a sense. It was good that a lot of people and a lot of classifications got reclassified at a large expense to the government, and a fairly large expense to the union too. But it gave our members a mindset that instead of negotiating for better wages to get a better deal on your wages, they got the idea that how you got more money was not negotiating, but putting in classification grievances. And unfortunately, some of that mindset's still here today. But I can't emphasize how badly the union suffered because of that piece of legislation. And it was many, many years before any significant changes were made at all to it. We tried and tried, and we spent a lot of money on it.
So Vic, during the early 70s, there was a lot of strife going on between the leadership and the CSAO. Could you maybe elaborate for us on that a bit?
Well, there was a real power struggle in the 70s between the executive board, the board of directors, and the then general manager, Harold Bowen. Harold Bowen had absolute power all through the time he was with CSAO during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and was not about to let go of it easily. So there were several disagreements between the presidents of CSAO and him. And the first president that I can recall was Wilf Foster, who gave the board at that time an ultimatum. Either he would go or Bowen go, and unfortunately he didn't. He didn't count his support because he went. Bowen stayed. The next president was George Gemmell, and the same scenario developed between him. But this time the board itself was fed up with Bowen and his authority and his changing board decisions and overriding the board and his authoritative ways. So eventually we voted to replace him. However, due to some stipulation, again in the Corporations Act, there are so many people can sign a petition or whatever it's called, and if it has so many names, then the corporation has to hold a special general meeting, and that's exactly what happened. A special general meeting was held, and that special general meeting told us to take Harold Bowen back. So he won again, and we ate crow, and a lot of it. But within 6 months, I believe, we got rid of them again. And the membership got a petition going, and they held a special general meeting again. And again, we were told to take them back. But in the dying moments of that special general meeting, SGM, somebody made a motion that that CSAO staff would have to retire at age 65 on their 65th birthday. They could no longer be with us. And Harold Bowen was quickly reaching 65. So I guess I could best describe his leaving as being dehired, because he was not fired. We tried that several times. But he was, because of this motion, forced to leave on his 65th birthday. And on his 65th birthday, he came to work, and all his doors and locks had been changed. He couldn't get into his office, and he was escorted out by security. So not a very noble way. In fact, a rather demeaning way for somebody that had been around for 30 years running the organization to leave it. But that's the way it was. And then when that happened, the staff went on strike over it. It was eventually ruled an illegal strike by the Labor Relations Board. And by that time, all the staff had been dismissed by the executive board. So if they wanted their jobs back, they had to come to us, and we sort of picked and chose who came and who didn't. It was not a pleasant time for anybody, but it was a power struggle on who was going to run the union. Was it going to be a general manager who was hired, or was it going to be a president and executive board who were elected by the members, or at least the board was elected by the members. The president at that time was still elected by the board, but that changed in 1965, November 1st, with the new Constitution. We'll eventually get to that too. We did hire, after Harold Bowen's the hiring, I guess, a person by the name of Ron Morris, who came from actually management in the Ministry of the Environment. But he never had he just didn't have what it takes to be able to survive in that kind of environment.
Jake Norman seems to be a very colorful fellow in the history of OPSU. Can you tell us a little more about him?
Well, Jake Norman was a colorful character in many ways, because he was a guy that didn't stay too long in too many places, but he had really big jobs. He was a master of PR. He knew how to handle people, and he knew negotiations inside out. Ironically, when we found him, he applied for the job of assistant general manager to Ron Morris, and he was running a gym in Montreal at the time, and he was perfectly bilingual, although he was not French, I don't believe. And Ron Morris went to Montreal to this gym to actually persuade him to come and work for OPSU, or CSAO at the time, which he did, and he was Ron Morris's assistant for a while. And one recollection I can have of him was we were trying to get into the Canadian Labour Congress at the time, and I was the chair of a committee that was spearheading that drive to get into Congress. And we went out to the CLC conference in 1974. It was in Vancouver at the time. And it was a really interesting conference, convention, because there was some internal strife in the CLC. There was a guy by the name of Boudre, who was a vice president at the time of the CLC, and Shirley Carr, who was from CUPE, was running for that position. Donald MacDonald was retiring, but he was the head of the Congress at that time. And what was happening was the head of all the Quebec Federation of Labor was a guy by the name of Louis Labarge, who just recently passed away, and probably a year ago. But at that time, he'd just come out of jail. He'd spent a good number of months in jail for causing a public service strike within the public service and the teachers in Quebec. And he was not a happy camper because Boudre did not go and visit him in jail. So that was a mistake on Boudre's part, because Labarge was going to make sure that he left the CLC under less than happy circumstances. And Shirley Carr, being from CUPE, had brought a large delegation to see that she got in, and what had happened there was CSAO was trying to get into the Canadian Labour Congress, and CUPE wanted us to get into them. So there was two big issues for us there. The main one being, if CUPE had all these delegates, we are going to have a hard time convincing the rest of the labor movement to accept us without being under CUPE's umbrella. And things happened just as one might expect. Boudre went down in a pile of flames. Shirley Carr was anointed practically with the majority of the votes from the floor, and plus the CUPE votes. And CSAO was told that they would not belong to the Congress at that time unless we went in through CUPE. So that was the message we had to bring home. But another interesting, maybe anecdote at that time, Jake Norman previously had been the Western head guy for the CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Company, at the time for the Western region. And he threw a big party in his room the night before with all his old cronies. And I just happened to be in the room next to him, and still couldn't get to sleep at about 4 o'clock in the morning, because they were all singing, well, Jake's a jolly good fellow, Jake's a jolly good fellow. And I'll swear his voice was louder than the rest of them in the thing. But in any event, we went home without belonging to the CLC. George Gemmell was president at the time, and it was myself, George Gemmell, that went out there. Frank Eastham was a guy that we more or less known as Jake Norman's boy Friday. He was the guy that did all the dirty work, so to speak, for Jake Norman later on. And we all came home with the same message, that we were not going to be allowed into the Canadian Labour Congress unless we went through CUPE. So that was where we stood there.
So Vic, when you were out at the CLC convention in 1974, Jake Norman was the assistant general manager of the CSAO. When did Jake become the manager?
Well, actually, during that period, there was a lot of people that became disenchanted with Ron Morris and his role as general manager, including Jake Norman, who came before the board and told the board he had no confidence in his boss anymore, and that him and Frank, his boy Friday, would be leaving unless Ron Morris left. So it was an ultimatum, and the board made the decision to dismiss Ron Morris, basically for incompetence. At that time, George Gemmell tested the water too and said that unless Charlie Darrow was taken out as first vice, he had no confidence in him, that he would go. And the board decided that Gemmell would go. They had the confidence in Darrow. So in that one meeting, Ron Morris was dismissed. George Gemmell resigned as president. He tested the water and lost. And the board set out the procedure to hire a new general manager, and Jake Norman then became the general manager. During that, one of the very first things he did was hire all of these old adversaries, really, because he was a manager then, from other unions like CUPE and the Public Service Alliance and Steel. He hired crackerjack negotiators, PR men, newspaper people, and put in a new team. And he also, I can never forget this, sitting in his office after a board meeting, there was about 4 of us one day, sitting in his office after a board meeting in 15 St. Mary Street, which was the headquarters of CSAO at the time, and saying, you know, I think, guys, we need a new building. He said, well, this doesn't, we're getting too big for it. Which was true. We were crowded for space. We needed more breathing area, room for the staff. And he says, you know, I have a friend of mine. I could talk to him. And he picks up the telephone in front of us and says, oh, Harry, a long time no see. Yeah, how's things? All the small talk. Then he says, look, Harry, I'm looking for a new building. 7-8 stories, centrally located, downtown Toronto. Do you have anything? Wasn't 5 seconds later, wherever Harry was, said, oh, I have something. It's located on the corner of Yonge and Davisville, right by a subway. It's 10 stories, but the first 3 stories, there are tenants. There's a banking firm on the bottom, or a credit, get banking or credit card, or Canada Trust it was, I guess, on the bottom, and there's 7 floors vacant. Should be all right for you. And Jake says, well, we'll have to think about it. They talked some prices. We couldn't overhear what they were, but he gets off the phone and he says, it's a good building, but they want $5 million for it. So we're kind of looking in awe at the guy. We left his office. We said, well, let's jump on the subway, run down to Davisville and Young, and let's see what he's talking about. Well, we get off the subway. We're across the street. My God, we look up. We're counting 10 stories. You can see they're all vacant from the third up. Here's the subway right across the street. And 7 floors are vacant. So we knew that he had been talking about something concrete, anyways, tangible, to this Harry guy. We no sooner got home to our respective areas, we get this conference call from Jake Norman saying, well, they wanted $5 million, but I got them down to $2.5 million. I think we should buy this thing. And we were all gung ho, 4. We bought that building over the phone for $2.5 million. And I started to think about it later. He'd set up this phone call. He had us in that office. Pretending first time he talked to this guy, he probably had several negotiations. The $5 million part was a bunch of BS. He probably had the $5 million price there, but if he was going to sell it to us, he had to start with $5 million and get down to 2.5. Now the interesting thing was we found out after he'd left CSAO or OPSU when he left, that we didn't own the land under the building. So we had to buy the land for another $2 million 3 or 4 years later. And he said, oh yeah, we'll use the 10th floor. The 10th floor, he says, can be a boardroom. But this great big table was $5,000 at the time. So big they had to use cranes to get it up the 10th floor from outside. Because that's the only way you could get it in the building. And he says, the rest, I want to keep the staff in shape, he said. So I've got a good deal on some gym equipment. And he said, if you want to go for that, we're all putting our hands up, get the gym equipment. Wasn't after the meeting we sort of triggered our memory that this guy owned a gym in Montreal, so guess what? We bought the gym equipment from him. So he was a pretty slippery character, but he got us a pretty good building for $2.5 million, even though we didn't own the land. So that was Jake Norman. But he certainly was characteristic, or he was a character.
Yeah, Vic, Jake Norman became the general manager by the end of '74. That was the year that the Ontario Public Servants got a large increase in wages. What part did Jake Norman play in this?
Well, John, as I said, we hired all these crackerjack negotiators, PR people, communications people from other unions, and we had a real team. And Jake Norman was the head of that team. He pulled all the strings, pushed all the buttons, and prior to negotiations, he was an expert PR guy, and he got the word out through the media that we meant business this time. We were looking for real meaningful increases. He riled up the membership, what we call the Electric Union Show. He had these things going all across the province by closed-circuit television from Toronto. He had the band, the Travelers, on stage singing union songs, and Charlie Darrell came out with on the stage, and prior to that, Jake's right-hand people had made all their research and why you should get this and why you got that, even though we did not have the right to strike. Charlie Darrow came out up on the stage in front of all those civil servants, members, and appeared across the province on closed-circuit television and said, "No contract, no work." And it was like thunder from in the crowds. And this was all media televised, radio. The government knew what was going on, or at least they thought they knew what was going on. They really fearful of a strike, even of an illegal one. And they got down to serious negotiations. There was a negotiator by the name of Chris Trower, who came from Steel. He did those negotiations, and he sweated it out with the government negotiators to the wee hours of the morning. And there were wage increases of 17.5% or something in that area. And corrections people, jail guards, got 21.5, and the whole thing was pulled off. And the government believed that there was going to be an illegal strike, but I can tell you, and anyone else that cares to know, that strike would never have been there. The people just weren't there. But the PR job that was done was so masterful that we pulled it off, that actually Jake Norman and his team pulled it off. So that was a high water mark in the history of CSAO before we came up. So that was probably the biggest event. Okay.
So Vic, now it's nearing the end of 1974. Jake Norman, along with the CSAO, got a large increase for the Ontario Public Service members of the union. So what was the next step for the CSAO?
Well, now that all the Ontario Public Service members had a whole lot extra money, we thought it would be time to increase the dues and start a campaign to release them from the shackles of the Crown Boys Collective Bargaining Act, the most repressive labor piece of legislation probably in the country. And up to this point, we'd had campaigns with to no avail to try to get out from under that act, or at least have it changed to the extent that we could negotiate some real issues besides wages. So there was a special general meeting, SGM, called basically for the purpose of a 50-cent dues increase per member to build up this Free the Servants campaign that was going to cost $500,000, $500,000 in the first stage. And what a campaign it was. I mean, there were so many different people involved with it, and so much PR, and so many radio, TV ads, critical of that government, the Conservative government, that it just became a blitz to the public. The public never heard of CSAO before. Now they're wondering who these people were, trying to get out from under this legislation and this unfair working conditions that this act imposed upon them. So Jake, if he hadn't made headlines during the negotiations, he was getting his PR pretty good through this campaign. Unfortunately, the government wouldn't budge. We never got any meaningful changes after spending all that money, all that time, and all that effort on that campaign. it's unbelievable, but the government wouldn't move. It wasn't until the new Democratic government got in some years later that we had somebody's ear to make those changes. But in spite of all the effort and a good effort and a sound logic reason to change it, fell on deaf ears with the Conservative government.
So Vic, now we're in 1975. I understand that in 1975 the CSAO went through some major restructuring. Can you tell us about it?
1975 was a major adjustment for the union. We had been called the union many years before and registered as one, but this was the litmus test for OPSEU in that respect, because on November 1st, the convention adopted a constitution for the first time. We had been governed by bylaws previously, but this constitution gave Civil Service Association Ontario a new name, the Ontario Public Service Employees Union, and we were having union in our name. The president and first vice president treasurer were elected from the floor instead of by the board, from the board. It was a major move there. And branches became locals. So like every other union now, locals were locals. So this was a major step for many people to come of age as a union, at least on paper. And we haven't seen that many changes of that magnitude in OPSEU up till that time. And we were still, unfortunately, governed by the Crown Employees Collective Bargaining Act and the Corporations Act. We still had those albatrosses, but that's when all the trade unionists in our union took pride, because we'd come of age.
So Vic, what other significant events took place during the time that Jake Norman was general manager of CSAO and OPSEU?
At the 1975 convention, when CSAO became OPSEU, Charlie Darrow was elected as president, the first president of OPSEU, and the first president was elected by the delegates, so he worked with Jake Norman through that period. And during that period, the government announced some very minor changes to the Crown Employees Collective Bargaining Act through Bill 179. They were nowhere near what we were looking for. So in the election of 74, the provincial election, we encouraged our members to vote against the Conservative Party, being very careful because we had political restrictions on how much we could influence as a public service union our members to vote against the government of the day. But that was our objective. If we want any movement to get this albatross of SECPA off our necks, we'd have to remove the government and then get rid of SECPA. So we embarked on a second phase of a Free the Servants campaign. It was again a costly venture, but to no avail. And then with Jake Norman, as things progressed, there was history repeating itself. The president and the executive board fighting once again with a general manager on who had the authority, who ran the union, why things were being done without the executive board's approval, and Jake Norman sort of running on a trail by himself. We just couldn't rein him in anymore, so at one board meeting, finally, we made a motion, or at least I made the motion, because I was on the board at that time, that his position be abolished. And that carried, and we had some negotiations on a settlement for him, which was not enormous. It was, I think he saw the light, was ready to go anyway. So that was Jake Norman's last day of tenure with OPSU. So he wasn't around very long, but he did a tremendous amount of union building while he was around. Unfortunately, he went the way of Bowen, and that was the last big struggle in our history that OPSU had, or CSAO and OPSU had, of identifying who controlled the union. Since that time, it's been taken for granted that the executive board, through the president, ran the union, not the hired help. And we weren't about to make the same mistake as we did in Bowen by firing him, because members told us to take him back. And I'm sure that would have been the case with Jake Norman again, so abolishing his position was a pretty good idea, even if it came from me. So Jake went on his way, and life went on in OPSU for the rest of us.
So Vic, now that Jake Norman's gone, I understand around that time NUPCHI was created. Can you maybe explain to us how that happened?
NUPCHI, the National Union of Provincial Government Employees, was created through some negotiations in 1976 between QP, Canadian Union of Provincial Government Employees, and OPSU, Ontario Public Service Employees Union, and all the other affiliates, provincial government. I was still, or I don't know if still, but I was again at the time the person from OPSU that was chair of any committee that had to do with trying to get into the Canadian Labour Congress, and the negotiations were not fruitful for OPSU. We didn't like the terms. QP agreed reluctantly that yes, we could come in, but only under the umbrella of a provincial government employees association, some umbrella body that covered all provincial governments, BC, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia. And that way we could get in, but we could not get in as OPSU. We could not get in by ourselves. So we did not buy into that. At the next CLC convention in 1976, I recall going to Quebec City, where that convention was held, with Shauna Flynn, who was first vice president of OPSU at the time, leafleting all these delegates going down the escalators that were going to vote whether we could come in or stay out or had to go under another affiliate. And those leaflets were to no avail, because the party line stuck with the Canadian Labour Congress. as it usually does, and we were told how we would get in, and that would be through this umbrella organization that we didn't want to belong to. We didn't think much of it. In fact, it was said by one high-ranking vice president of OPSU that nope, she was a sewer that we had to crawl through to get into the Canadian Labour Congress. So we didn't think much of that organization at that time anyways. The first president of NIPSI was a guy by the name of Bill Jackson, and we didn't have a whole lot of faith in him either, so once again, we're on the sidelines of the mainstream labor movement.
Vic, during the 1975-1976 time, the union went through some transitional changes from an association to a union. Were there other changes at that time?
There were some big changes made during that period. Jake Norman had brought us from a tea and crumpets union or association to a business union, business type unionism, and we were now developing into a social union. We were the first union in Canada to hire a full-time equal opportunities coordinator, or at least create that position, because the first person that filled it was already on staff. So we're progressing in that direction, and I guess that's the good news, but the bad news was that the first equal opportunities coordinator was not a woman, but a man. A guy by the name of Neil Loudon, who was currently working in public relations with OPSU, and one of his biggest accomplishments, I guess, in that position was to create a province-wide Pee-wee hockey tournament sponsored by OPSU. Basically a little boys' game, so it was not an achievement that most women were looking for in OPSU in the labor movement. So he was not happy in that position either. So we advertised for a woman to fill this equal opportunities coordinator, and we hired a person by the name of Debbie Field. Not a particularly popular individual with the executive board at that time, because they were mostly men, and we did not see eye to eye on some of her views, one of which was to modify the seniority in union to super seniority for minority groups and women type of thing. Did not really catch the eye of most of the people that were probably had lots to lose. It wasn't the kind of response that the labor movement was looking at, watering down one of the cornerstones of the union movement, seniority. So, and it was interesting that she reported directly to the president. She had no other boss. Reported directly to the president, and thought she made too much money. She was hired at the time when Shauna Flynn was president. Shauna Flynn agreed that she made enough, said she should make the money she was making. She thought that she was being overpaid for the position she was in. So I brought that to the officers. I was the vice president at the time. And I agreed with her, and the officers agreed with her, and she received a $12,000 pay cut, which was not making Shauna Flynn very happy. He came through how he came to the union movement was in Ireland. He was going in for a priest, and changed his mind and worked in the coal mines. And they used to call him the priest in the coal mines because he never swore. But he swore that day. He swore at me because he didn't want her taking that $12,000 pay cut. But she had her ideas how things were going to go, and pretty well the rest of us had other ideas. So she again went the way of Jake Norman and others that had different views than the executive board. And from there, we hired Dana Green. I forget how long she was with us. And then Frances Lankin was the next one. Frances Lankin is the same Frances Lankin that was Deputy Premier of Ontario under the Bob Rae NDP government. But so we had a shaky beginning for the Equal Opportunities Coordinator, and but the position is still with us. No longer reports to the President, but that position is still with us today.
OPSU now became a fully fledged union by 1975. When did it have its first major provincial-wide strike?
OPSU's first major strike, province-wide strike at least, we'd had strikes before, but they were localized. But the first province-wide strike was with the CAT Support Unit in January 1979, and it was cold. It was not. I flew in from Toronto to Thunder Bay that time on the Monday morning. Oh my God, it was cold. It was something like 38 below here, but it was cold across the province. I recall that. It was freezing cold in Toronto and Kingston and Sudbury, everywhere. It was a nasty start for people that didn't know much about a strike, including all of us, board staff and members who'd never been through something like this, of such a major coordination required to coordinate this whole thing, city by city, local by local, right to the province of Ontario. And there were no real significant gains that I recall out of that strike, other than it gave them respect. It gave the CAT Support respect from the management that they never had before. So that was probably the most significant thing that came out of that strike, and one that they were looking for. But the money, I don't recall specifically what the money was, but it was nothing to write home about it. But respect was the main thing they earned.
So Vic, that was the legal strike in 1979. There was also an illegal strike. Can you tell us about that?
Well, there was another strike in 1979, but it was not legal. It was an illegal strike by the correctional officers of the province. And the strike was not about wages or working conditions. It was about having a separate wage bargaining category from the hospital workers. the category was bunched together as institutional care and corrections, and corrections felt that they would be better served and better paid if they could separate themselves from the hospital workers. Of course, the sectional legislation had them grouped there, and that's what they were up against. The government refused to budge, and at that time we made a bunch of waves. Sean O'Flynn assured the correction guys that he would do everything possible to get them this separate category, and they chose to have an illegal walkout, which he supported. They were off the job. He was told that to get them back to work, he refused. They finally government finally caved in while these people were on strike illegally, and gave them their separate category. And when all the smoke cleared, there was 7 or 8 people charged, including myself. But the only one that went to jail was a Flynn. And he went to jail, I believe, for 17 days, I believe he was in there. Was not a happy camper, because I used to have to go visit him to get these papers signed, and let me tell you, nobody likes jail, but he hated it. And when he got out, I was there too. There was a whole crowd to greet him, but he was not happy in confinement, believe you me. But that was significant again, that when we put our money where our mouth was, we got the attention that we deserved. But otherwise, they paid little attention to us. The government didn't think much of us till we created some havoc for them.
Vic, the union continued to go under further changes.
Well, in 1979, finally, we went and joined NUPSI, the National Union of Provincial Government Employees, so that we could finally get into the Ontario Federation of Labour and the Canadian Labour Congress. Prior to that, the Ontario delegation into NUPSI was the Liquor Control Board employees or members, which is minimal to our members, and they had their representative on the board representing Ontario, which was really not representation of civil servants, but NUPSI made do with it because of all the fighting and infighting we had. And we finally did take that plunge and joined them in 1979, and in the spring of 1980 I was elected as the first OPSU Ontario vice president of NUPSI, and I served 2.5, I guess, terms, 2-year terms in that capacity with OPSU. So it was a long haul for us to get into the Canadian Labour Congress, and I know that because I was there all the way, and closely involved all the way. It was one of the people that had pushed hard for that, and it was a good day for me when it happened.
So Vic, OPSU created a Equal Opportunities Coordinator, which was a paid member of OPSU staff. How did the membership in the union get involved in the equity issues?
Well, the membership got involved in the Equal Opportunities Program when the board made it possible by creating what was known as the Provincial Women's Committee, PWC. There were 7 regions in OPSU, and there was one person elected from each region. So during our regional meetings, when we elected people for other committees, etc., we had the elections for these 7 women that were to sit with the Equal Opportunities Coordinator and held meetings in Toronto, I don't know, monthly or whenever, but the provision was there. And this region, Thunder Bay, Region 7, elected a person by the name of Terry Conley was elected at our regional meeting. Terry Conley was a man, so we're a little bit different than the rest of the regions because they all elected women, but nobody told us that there had to be women. It said equal opportunities, and we assumed that equal opportunity meant equal opportunity for all. Terry Conley found out somewhat different when he went to attend his first meeting in Toronto because they wouldn't let him into the meeting, no men allowed. So even though he was duly elected by his peers, by the delegates of this region, our representative was not allowed in the meeting. So one wonders about how equal opportunities was meant to be.
What were some of the other important events in the 80s?
Well, in the 1980s and the early 1980s, we broadened our scope of bargaining and organizing. We got into a lot of organizational drives that we hadn't pursued these people, such as children's treatment centers and children's aid societies. Associations, community living, those kind of areas we hadn't been into, municipal areas. So organizing became a bigger chunk of our interest, because the public service was shrinking. And the broader public service, the BPS, was getting much larger, so we had to pick up those people that we were losing, and we picked up some others on the way besides that. The mostly quasi-public service type of organizations. And then in 1984 we had our first CAD academic strike, which was another major undertaking because it was a province-wide strike, and that took a lot of energy from the staff and members to support those people during their first strike. The Inflation Restraint Act came in during the later 80s. So it was a form of wage control again. We had to fight that. But that was the most significant things during that period.
You know, Vic, the strike fund was formed in the 1980s. Now that was a major event. How did that come about?
The strike of 79, the 2 strikes actually, 79, the legal one, which was the CAT support strike, and the illegal corrections strike, plus the teacher strike in 1984, the CAT academic strike. we had some big concerns about having funds to back up these strikes if they had lasted longer or they were becoming more province-wide, which was a costly venture to maintain and support. So even though the public service at this time did not have the right to strike, we had ventured into this area at conventions to try to establish strike funds in prior years at convention, with very little success. But we established $6 million strike fund in the mid-'80s, which started us off with some funds to be able to support any kind of major work disruptions that we would encounter and envisioned encountering, because we had still not given up on the right to strike for the public service, and with that view is why that strike fund was mainly established. In 1994, OPSU had achieved joint control of the pension fund. Again, another significant achievement on the union's part, because we had fought for a long time for this joint control. At one time, the public service pension fund was just a figure on the books. There was no money whatsoever in the fund. All the contributions by employees, by members, were used to run the government. And the government never put a penny into it. It was just a book figure. So this is the difficulty we had in trying to convince the government to give us joint control over the fund. There was no fund. So we had to build from there. And the fight's not over. Even again in the 2002 contract, they were looking for clawbacks. It was a long, hard fight that caused a strike again in the public service. So since the inception of SECPA in 1972, the right to strike and the pension fund were the final two achievements of our goals and our battles against the Crown Employees Collective Bargaining Act. In 1995, the government introduced essential service legislation through SECPA, which took a lot of the thunder out of our right to strike legislation, because we just couldn't completely shut the employer down. Arguments developed, and a lot of time was wasted over negotiations of who was essential, who wasn't essential, and in many instances our power to bring the governments to its knees, to stop the government, to stop the employer from operating, were nullified with the Essential Services Act. In 1996, it finally happened. The first Ontario Public Service strike, province-wide strike, largest strike in the province had ever seen. This was the test. This was the test to make OPSU a union. All the other methods of making trade unionists out of members paled in the light of this strike, because as long as we had tried for not years but decades to get the teeth into the rank and file of our membership in the public service through educationals, decades of having these supposedly democratic meetings of electing delegates from the bottom to the top, setting demands, demands that really didn't mean a whole lot to pursue because they went to arbitration anyways. No one had to stand up and be counted to put their mouth where their money was, their mouth was, walking picket lines to substantiate these demands. This was the real litmus test for OPSU. Now, the strike, the jury may be out, I'm not sure, on whether members needed this strike. But the bottom line, OPSU needed this strike. They needed this strike to prove they were a union, that they finally could say, we are a union. This was, as I said, the litmus test. And although there were errors made, and history again will show us there's errors made, overall it was a successful strike. We had some people, scabs crossing picket lines, far too many, and we were not harsh enough on them, in my opinion. However, all in all, we survived the day. In 1999, the OPSU again ventured on a new strategy of what we called strategic voting in the provincial election. In the past, for many years, we had always publicly voiced our support for the New Democratic Party, and we had actually at one point brought them with our help into power. This time around, we felt that there was such a need to get rid of the Conservative government in this province that we would be prepared to support any candidate that had any kind of a chance whatsoever to defeat a Conservative candidate in that riding. And that's how we supported them, whether they were NDP, Liberal, or Independents, or whatever. We were that desperate to get rid of this government, and that's the campaign that we ventured on. So with the Network for Better Contracts, we again approached another significant milestone in OPSU. We changed the way we do business in many aspects, and I'm sure that many of you have had some experience and training in our methods that were derived from the Network for Better Contracts. The 2002 strike, of course, I'm not sure how many people here want to be reminded of that strike, so it's such recent, freshly in everybody's memory, but again, a significant undertaking by any union to run a strike of that magnitude, province-wide. It took a lot of people doing a lot of things, and again had to include everybody, which was rank and file members, which, as I said, was the litmus test for OPSU in the 1996 strike, because everyone had to be involved. So again, once again, I hope you can see how this course demonstrates our progress from a teen Crumpson's organization association to a business-oriented union, and finally to a social-oriented union. Now, did we learn from our mistakes? I think we did somewhat when it came to all the fights, the internal fights between the elected people and the hired help, and the battle for elected control. I believe that that battle is finally won, that the people that are elected run their own union. The people that are hired to do the jobs, and never the twain shall meet. Now, the first OPSU strike, 1996, did we learn from that? Yes, we did learn, because that, as I said previously, was when we became a union. All the other significant things, pretty much all together, could not equal what that particular event did to make Toronto, OPSU, a true trade union. And the 2002 strike, well, I think the jury's still out on that. I'm not sure that we've had enough time to assess the pros and cons of all that strike. I think the jury's still out on the Network for Better Contracts concept. I think that still has to prove itself. At least to me, it does. And I still say, with some fervor, that OPSU, as a union, has to start learning to deal with scabs. I've never seen another union treat scabs so leniently as this one does. Their scabs are the lowest form of life there is. They're stealing food from your table. They're robbers. So somebody, before the next strike comes, should have some kind of idea how that's stopped, how they can be stopped. And if they want some suggestions, call me. Again, being critical is a necessary element in our past. It's a necessary measure of our willingness to overcome the obstacles and in determining our future. So we have to learn from our past, and we must know what history has taught us. So I hope you've all learned something today.
Solidarity forever, solidarity forever, for the union makes us strong. Oh, the women of the union, they have just begun to fight. They have learned of women's issues, they have learned of women's rights. They're prepared to fight for freedom.